On February 23, 1945, a group of U.S. Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle for Iwo Jima. The photograph of this moment, captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, became the most famous image of World War II and perhaps the most iconic war photograph ever taken. It symbolized victory, sacrifice, and American determination. But behind that snapshot lies a story more complex than the myth. The truth is that the iconic image was not the first flag raised that day, and the circumstances of its capture reveal how history often remembers symbols rather than details. Early that morning, Marines from the 28th Regiment climbed the steep volcanic slopes of Suribachi under fire. When they reached the summit, they raised a small American flag using an iron water pipe as a staff. This first flag raising electrified the men below. Marines on the beaches and ships offshore erupted in cheers. For them, it was a visible sign of progress in a battle that had already claimed thousands of lives. But commanders worried. The flag was too small. It could not be seen clearly from the beaches, and they feared it might be lost or stolen as a war trophy. A decision was made to replace it with a larger, more visible flag. That afternoon, another group of Marines carried the second, larger flag up the mountain. It was this moment, captured by Rosenthal's lens, that the world came to know. Yet for the men who had raised the first flag, there was bitterness. Their triumph had been overshadowed, and few outside their units even knew their names. Over time, the distinction between the two events blurred, and the second flag raising became the story. It was clean, dramatic, and powerful, a single image that carried the weight of a nation's hope. The myth grew in the years that followed. The photograph won a Pulitzer Prize within weeks of being published. It was used to sell war bonds, rally the American public, and memorialize the Marine sacrifice. Few asked questions about whether it was the real first flag or about the men who had planted the smaller flag hours earlier. For history, the picture was enough. The truth, however, was more complicated. The flag atop Suribachi was raised twice, and the Marines who risked everything to hoist the first colors never stood in Rosenthal's frame. This is the story behind the symbol, how a moment of courage was transformed into myth, and how one photograph came to define an entire battle, while leaving behind the full truth of what happened that day. The difference between the two flag raisings on Iwo Jima may seem small, but it have enormous consequences for how the world remembers the battle. The first flag, carried up Mount Suribachi by a patrol led by Lieutenant Harold Schreer, was a modest banner taken from a Navy transport ship. When it was planted, the reaction was immediate. Men fighting on the beaches stopped for a moment to cheer. Ships blasted their horns, and for the Marines slogging through the black volcanic sand, the sight of the stars and stripes waving high above gave them a surge of hope. For them, this was the moment when Suribachi was theirs. Yet outside the island, almost no one saw it. Only a handful of photographs captured that first raising, and none carried the drama of what would come later. The second flag raising was not meant to overshadow the first. It was a matter of practicality. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, the battalion commander, ordered a larger flag to be sent up so it could clearly be seen by the troops below and by the fleet offshore. He wanted a symbol that could not be missed. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Privates Franklin Sousley, Rene Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, along with Navy corpsman John Bradley, were tasked with the mission. They carried the larger flag up the mountain, secured it to a piece of pipe, and raised it high above the summit. It was at that moment that Joe Rosenthal, climbing alongside other photographers, snapped his famous picture. The image, frozen in time, was raw and dynamic. 6 figures straining together, the flag tilting forward as if pushed by the wind, the volcanic slope beneath their boots. Unlike a staged photograph, it conveyed motion, struggle, and triumph all at once. When it hit newspapers back home, Americans saw not just a flag, but the embodiment of victory and unity. Yet this second raising created confusion. Many Marines on the island felt that the first patrol had been robbed of recognition. The men who had braved enemy fire in the morning were largely forgotten, while those in the second photo became instant symbols. Even Rosenthal's image was misinterpreted. Some critics at the time believed it was staged, though Rosenthal always maintained he simply caught the action as it happened. Over the years, debates over who exactly was in the picture added another layer of myth. For decades, names were misattributed, corrected, and recorrected as historians and the Marine Corps worked to identify each flag raiser correctly. This confusion highlights a deeper truth. History often remembers what is seen, not necessarily what occurred first. The first flag raising was the reality. The second flag raising became the legend. And in the crucible of war, it was the legend that endured, because it could be printed, shared, and carried in the hearts of millions who longed for signs of victory. Once Rosenthal's photograph reached the United States, it spread with lightning speed. Published in newspapers coast to coast, it was hailed as the perfect image of American resolve. The picture seemed to capture everything the public longed to believe, that unity, sacrifice, and determination would carry the nation to victory. Within days, it won the Pulitzer Prize, a rare honor for a photo so recent, and it was reproduced on posters, newspapers, and eventually carved in bronze for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington. But beyond symbolism, the photograph became a weapon of propaganda, one that the U.S. government used to fuel the war effort in its final grueling year. The United States was still locked in a brutal campaign across the Pacific. Casualties were mounting, and the planned invasion of Japan promised to be even bloodier. The government urgently needed to sustain public support and raise money. Rosenthal's image provided exactly what they needed. The 6 flag raisers were pulled from their units and sent back to the U.S. for the 7th War Loan Drive, a nationwide campaign to sell war bonds. They toured cities, stood before crowds, and told their story, often under crushing pressure, while the iconic image loomed behind them. The flag raising became not just a moment of battlefield courage, but a tool to raise billions of dollars essential for continuing the fight. For the Marines themselves, the sudden fame was often a burden. Ira Hayes, a Pima Native American, was thrust into the spotlight but felt deeply uncomfortable. He insisted that the true heroes were those still fighting and dying on Iwo Jima. The other flag raisers struggled as well, some resenting that they had become symbols while their comrades remained unknown or unrecognized. The weight of representing the myth while knowing the truth was more complex haunted several of them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the American public embraced the image wholeheartedly. It appeared to offer a clean narrative. The Marines raised the flag, the island was won, and victory was certain. But the reality was far harsher. The battle for Iwo Jima raged on for more than a month after the flag went up, with thousands more Marines killed and wounded. The photograph did not show the blood, the tunnels, or the desperation of the fighting that continued long after the shutter clicked. Yet in the American imagination, the flag raising became the shorthand for victory on Iwo Jima and even for the war in the Pacific itself. This gap between myth and reality is what makes the story so compelling. The photo inspired millions, raised fortunes for the war effort, and honored the Marines' courage. But it also obscured the truth of what happened on that mountain. In the end, Rosenthal's frame did more than document history. It shaped it, turning a fleeting moment into an eternal symbol that still defines the memory of Iwo Jima today. The legacy of the Iwo Jima flag raising reveals more than just the courage of Marines. It reveals how history itself is shaped. The flag myth reminds us that symbols often eclipse facts, not because the facts are unimportant, but because symbols are what people carry in their hearts. The second flag raising, immortalized by Rosenthal's photograph, became the enduring memory of Iwo Jima. It stood for sacrifice, unity, and triumph. Yet the first flag raising, the one cheered by Marines on the beaches and sailors offshore, faded into obscurity, even though it was no less real, no less courageous. This selective memory highlights a truth about war. Nations need stories that inspire, not details that complicate. For America in 1945, the photograph gave people exactly what they needed. It reassured families that their sons' sacrifices had meaning. It provided a rallying cry for a nation weary of war. And it created a vision of victory that looked inevitable, even as the fighting on Iwo Jima dragged on in brutal fashion. Without such symbols, the war effort might have faltered under the weight of grief and exhaustion. But for the men who lived the moment, the myth carried a price. Some flag raisers spent the rest of their lives explaining what happened, correcting misidentifications, or struggling under the pressure of being national icons. Ira Hayes, in particular, found fame to be a heavy burden, a reminder of comrades lost rather than glory won. The distance between the myth embraced by the public and the reality endured by the Marines left scars as deep as any wound from the battlefield. Over time, historians worked to set the record straight, identifying the two separate flag raisings and the men involved. Yet even today, most people know only the iconic image, not the complicated story behind it. The myth endures because it speaks to something larger than the details of who raised which flag when. It speaks to the idea that, in the darkest hours, ordinary men can accomplish something extraordinary. That truth, though wrapped in myth, continues to resonate. The Marine Corps embraced the photograph as its eternal symbol, enshrining it in the massive bronze monument near Arlington Cemetery. Generations of Americans visit it, seeing in the figures of bronze not the confusion of two flag raisings, but the unity of 6 men straining together for something greater than themselves. In that sense, the myth has become its own reality. The flag myth shows us that history is not just a record of facts, it is also a tapestry of symbols. The first flag, the second flag, the truth, the photograph, all are part of the same story. Together, they remind us that the cost of Iwo Jima was measured in blood, but its memory was shaped by a single, unforgettable image.